She was 21 years old, sleeping on a church pew in Alderton, West Virginia, and she had $11 and a library card when she bought the cottage. Not a metaphor, an actual church pew in a building that had stopped being a church in 1987 and had been renting floor space to people in short-term crisis since 2019, and where the overnight policy was 3 nights maximum, and Wren Halley was on her second. She had come to Alderton because the county legal aid office was there, and because she had a matter that needed a county record corrected, a matter she will get to in a moment, and because the bus from Charleston had let her off at the Alderton depot, and she had $37 at that point, and the cheapest motel room was $49. She found the notice at the bottom of a stack of county surplus disposal filings she was reading at the public library on her second morning in town, specifically because the library had heat and she was cold, and a stack of county filings gave her a reason to stay. The notice described a single parcel, a stone cottage on 4 acres in Burnt Hollow, 7 miles east of Alderton. Last assessed in 1963, tax forfeited for 38 years, minimum bid to clear the lien, $10. She paid the $10 at the county clerk's window the next morning with exact change, spent her last dollar on a bus token, and walked the final 2 miles to Burnt Hollow on a gravel road in February, with everything she owned in a canvas duffel that had been her grandmother's. What she found beneath the hearthstone of that cottage, lifted by her own hands 3 weeks later after the floor told her something wasn't right, would eventually reach people who had decided Wren Halley's story was already over. And it would reach them the way truth tends to reach people who have been comfortable in its absence, quietly and all at once, and with no good place to look. If stories like this one find you when you need them, stories about people who kept going past the point where keeping going made any obvious sense, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, and it keeps us going. Drop a comment wherever you're watching from. We love knowing who's out there. Wren Halley had grown up in Clover Fork, which was a small community in the eastern coalfields of West Virginia, where the topography made everything feel like it was happening at the bottom of something. Her grandmother, Della, had raised her from the age of 4, when Wren's mother had left for reasons that were never fully explained to Wren's satisfaction, which was partly because she was 4, and partly because the explanation, had it been given honestly, would not have been satisfying regardless. Della was not a warm woman in the soft sense. She didn't say much. She expressed affection through proximity rather than language. She made biscuits every morning and pushed one toward you without comment, and that was essentially the full range of her demonstrative register. But she was constant. In Wren's experience, constancy was rarer than warmth and worth more. Della had a small house and a garden and a fierce relationship with her vegetable patch that she maintained into her 80s with a stubbornness that impressed everyone who saw it. She had one skill that had made her a quiet local institution. She could read land. She had an instinct for drainage and soil composition and the way a hillside caught light at different times of year, and people in the community had been coming to her for 40 years whenever they were trying to decide whether a piece of ground was worth farming or building on. She had never charged for this. She had never been asked why not. It was simply one of the things Della did, the way other people kept a porch light on. She also had, at some point in a past she had never fully explained to Wren, put her name on a piece of property that Wren had not known about until Della died. Wren was 18 when Della died, a Tuesday in October, unremarkable weather, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself as the last of something. Della left her the small house and its contents, and the garden, and a bank account with $412 in it. And it would have been a modest, but manageable inheritance, except that Della had not paid property taxes on the small house for 9 years, because she had been old and increasingly confused about paperwork, and had told no one. And the county had been patient up to a point, and had then not been patient, and by the time Wren understood the full shape of what she was dealing with, The back taxes plus penalties had accumulated to a number she could not pay, and could not borrow, and could find no legitimate path around. There was a cousin, a second cousin, technically, a man named Lyle who was 44 and had never paid much attention to Wren or to Della, while Della was alive, but who had very decided opinions about the property now that the situation was complicated. Lyle had appeared at the house 3 weeks after Della's funeral, with a man he introduced as his attorney, which Wren later understood was an overstatement of the man's role, and had explained with a combination of sympathy and efficiency that was somehow worse than either alone, that if Wren could not clear the tax lien, the property would go to the county, and that he was prepared to pay the back taxes himself in exchange for the deed. He was doing this, he explained, for the family. He had said it in a tone that did not invite inspection. Wren was 18 years old and had just buried her grandmother and had no money and no one to call. She did not sign anything that day. She asked for a week. Lyle said that was fine, with a smile that suggested he knew the arithmetic of her situation better than she did. He was right about the arithmetic. 3 weeks later, Wren Halley signed the house over to Lyle and walked out of Clover Fork with $412 in her grandmother's canvas duffel, and the knowledge that she had been handled, and that the handling had been too smooth and too fast for her to find a way out of it, and that she needed to understand things better than she currently did if she was going to prevent it from happening again. She spent the next 3 years getting better at understanding things. She worked at a diner in Beckley, at a laundry in Fayetteville, at a counter in a legal aid office in Charleston, where a woman named Patricia Osai let her answer phones in exchange for sitting in on client consultations, which was the education Wren had decided she needed, and which Patricia, who recognized something in the way Wren paid attention, provided without making anything of it. She also discovered, 2 years after Della's death, that the property Della had put her name on, the piece of ground Wren hadn't known about, had been recorded incorrectly at the county. Della's name misspelled in a way that had caused it to drop out of the estate and into a clerical limbo. That was what had brought her to Alderton. The county record correction was a matter Patricia had helped her identify and had said she was capable of handling herself if she went in person, which Wren had done. Which was why she'd been on a church pew with $11 when she found the notice about the cottage. The record correction, it turned out, would take 6 weeks. The cottage was available now. These two facts sat beside each other in Wren's mind on the morning she found the notice, and she did what she had learned to do when two facts sat next to each other unexpectedly. She looked at them for a while and figured out what they were telling her. She paid the $10. She walked to Burnt Hollow. The cottage was stone, actual fieldstone, dry, stacked in the old Appalachian way, the walls 2 feet thick and completely solid, which was the first thing Wren noticed and the first thing that changed the tone of what she'd been expecting. A structure built like that did not fall down easily. It had been built to last by people who knew stone and knew time, and understood that both were more patient than people and should be respected accordingly. The roof had failed, the rafters had given way in the center, and the remaining shingles hung at angles that suggested they were only staying out of habit, but the walls were standing as straight as the day they'd been laid. And the floor, which was wide, flat stones rather than wood, was intact from one end of the cottage to the other. There was a hearth at the north end, a massive thing, built of the same fieldstone as the walls, the lintel a single piece of sandstone 3 inches thick and 6 feet long. The firebox was deep and clean. Nothing had burned in it in many years, but whatever had burned before had left the stone seasoned in the way of a hearth that had been used seriously, for heat rather than for decoration, for a long time. Wren set her duffel down on the stone floor and stood in the middle of the single room for a while and listened to the silence, which was the particular silence of a structure that had been empty a long time but was still whole. Not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of waiting, which is a different thing entirely. She was going to need a roof. Everything else was negotiable. There was a woman who lived a half-mile up the hollow, in a house that was modest but clearly maintained, whose name was Ruth Gaynor, and who was 79 years old, and who had, as Wren discovered on her second morning, when Ruth arrived at the cottage door with a jar of apple butter and a look that communicated a lifetime of having assessed things quickly and accurately. Been watching the cottage since it went dark in the 1980s. Ruth was not a talker. She was an observer who spoke when she had something specific to say, which Wren recognized as her grandmother's register exactly, and which made her trust Ruth before she had any other reason to. "Roof first," Ruth said, standing in the doorway, taking in the collapsed rafters. "I know," Wren said. "Silas Crane does roofing. He's honest, and he'll work a trade if you don't have cash." "What kind of trade?" Ruth looked at her. "He's got 80 acres on the ridge that his father left him, and he doesn't know what to do with it. Knows nothing about land." A pause. "You strike me as someone who might." This was more than Wren had told Ruth about herself, which meant Ruth had either guessed or had sources Wren didn't know about yet. Either way, she was right. Wren had grown up watching Della read land the way other people read faces, and she had absorbed it without knowing she was absorbing it, the way you absorb the things that happen every day in the house where you're raised. She met Silas Crane the following afternoon. He was 48, quiet, with large hands, and the particular competence of a man who had done physical work his entire life and had stopped needing to prove it. He walked Wren to the cottage and looked at the roof for a while, and then said he could do it, and told her what it would cost in materials, and that he'd eat the labor if she'd come up to the ridge with him and tell him what she saw. They went up to the ridge the next day. Wren walked it slowly, the way Della had always walked new land, not in a straight line, but in a pattern that covered the ground at different angles, reading the drainage and the aspect, and the composition of what was underfoot. She told Silas what she found, that the upper third of the ridge was too thin and too steep to be worth farming, but had timber value. That the middle section had a seam of soil that was deeper than it looked and faced south-southeast, which was as good an orientation as you got in this part of West Virginia, that there was a wet area in the northwest corner that was currently a liability, but could be managed into a seasonal pond that would double the land's usefulness to wildlife and reduce erosion on the slope below it. She said all of this in the same tone Della had used, which was the tone of someone reading a map, not giving a speech. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Nobody's ever told me any of that. It's what the land says," Wren said. "I'm just translating." He put the roof on in 4 days. Materials only, as agreed. He also, without being asked, brought a second man and replaced the 2 rotted lintels above the cottage's windows while he was at it, because he said it would bother him to leave them. "If you're still here, thank you for staying. I know this one is building slowly, but it's building towards something, and I'd like to ask you now, before we get there, to subscribe if you haven't. Stories like Wren's are exactly why this channel exists. And now, here is where it gets interesting." She had been in the cottage for 3 weeks when the floor told her something. She had been living on the stone floor, sleeping bag laid directly on it, camp stove in the firebox, the new roof keeping the weather out, and the stone walls keeping the cold from being absolute. She knew the floor the way you know a space you inhabit completely, every stone's dimensions, the way two of them near the east wall rocked slightly under weight. The faint unevenness near the hearth, where the stones were slightly larger and more carefully laid than the surrounding floor. It was the careful laying that caught her attention, not careless variation, intentional variation. Someone had chosen those particular stones for that particular spot and set them with a precision that the rest of the floor, adequate as it was, did not match. She got down on her hands and knees with a flashlight on a Sunday morning and examined the hearthstone area slowly. The stones in front of the firebox were 3 large slabs, each perhaps 18 inches across, set tight and flat and level. The center slab had a seam around its edges that was fractionally wider than the seams between the other stones, not immediately visible, but once she saw it. Definitive, she ran a butter knife around the edge and felt it catch on one corner, the corner closest to the firebox, where the stone's edge had a small concavity worn into it, not by accident and not by time. By hands, repeatedly reaching for the same spot in the same way in the dark. She got a flat bar from the toolbox Silas had left in the corner. The hearthstone came up clean. It had been sitting in its frame without mortar, fitted precisely, its own weight holding it. Beneath it was a void, perhaps 2 feet deep, the sides lined with flat shale laid without mortar in the same careful way as the wall stones. The void was dry and completely dark. At the bottom was a wooden box, not much larger than a bread loaf, made of what she later identified as chestnut, the old-growth kind, close-grained and nearly indestructible, which explained how it had survived. The box had a simple clasp, no lock. She lifted it out and set it on the hearthstone and opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of wool flannel that had dried to a stiff board but had kept everything beneath it intact, were 4 things. The first was a folded paper, hand-lettered in a careful script she recognized as the kind taught in rural Appalachian schoolrooms in the early part of the last century. Deliberate, upright, no flourish. The paper said, "This house and its 4 acres belong to the Gaynor family and were paid for in full by Thomas Gaynor in the year of our Lord 1887. It was signed by Thomas Gaynor and witnessed by 2 names she didn't recognize, and beneath the signatures, in different ink and a different hand, a single added line, hidden here for safekeeping. March 1933. Bessie, the second, was a tobacco tin, sealed with a strip of waxed paper wound around the lid several times. Inside the tin were coins, not currency in the modern sense but pre-Depression silver, Liberty $50, Barber quarters, a handful of Mercury dimes. 41 coins in total. She counted them twice. The third was a letter, longer than the paper, written on the same lined paper in the same careful hand. The writer identified herself as Bessie Gaynor, wife of Thomas Gaynor's son, William, and she explained that she was writing this in March of 1933 because the bank in Alderton had failed the previous October, and because a man from the county had come to the hollow twice, asking about the property, and she did not trust either the man or the county at that particular moment in history, which was not an unreasonable position to take in rural West Virginia in March of 1933. She wrote that the property deed above was the true record of ownership, and that if anyone claimed otherwise they were mistaken or lying, and she wrote that the coins were all she had of value that was portable, and that she was putting them here because the floor had held secrets before, and she expected it would hold this one. She wrote, "I do not know who will find this. I know someone will. This hollow has been good to us, and I believe it will be good to whoever comes next, if they come with honest intentions. I am putting this here trusting that they will. Whoever you are, welcome to this place. It is a good place. Treat it accordingly." The fourth thing was a photograph, small and oval, mounted on the stiff card backing common to portraits of that era. It showed a woman in her 40s, with a direct expression and large hands resting in her lap, not folded, resting. The way you rest hands that have worked and are taking a moment. On the back, in pencil Bessie, 1931, Wren sat on the stone floor with the photograph and looked at the woman's hands for a long time. She went to Ruth Gaynor's house that afternoon. Ruth opened the door before she knocked. "You found it," Ruth said. It was not a question. Wren looked at her. "You knew." "My mother told me her grandmother had put something under the hearth. She didn't know what, and she didn't know exactly where, and by the time she was old enough to look, the cottage had been empty 20 years, and she couldn't bring herself to go in." Ruth stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat at Ruth's kitchen table. Wren laid out the 4 things: the deed, the tin of coins, the letter, the photograph, and Ruth looked at each one slowly, touching the photograph last. She didn't say anything for a while. "Bessie," she said finally. She said it quietly, with the particular weight of a name that has existed only in family story for a very long time and has now become something you can touch. Ruth Gaynor was, it turned out, Bessie Gaynor's great-great-granddaughter, living half a mile from the cottage her ancestor had hidden these things in, and had never known precisely what was there. The coins, at current silver value, were worth considerably more than Bessie could have known. Pre-Depression silver had appreciated in ways that Depression-era Appalachian housewives had no means to anticipate. The deed, though 90 years old, was legally significant. The property's title chain had a gap from the 1960s forward that had never been cleanly resolved, and the 1887 original deed in Bessie Gaynor's careful handwriting established something the county records had not been able to confirm on their own. Sandra Okafor, no. That was another story. Another woman, another hollow. The lawyer Wren found was a man named Douglas Fenn, who practiced in Alderton, and who had a reputation for taking property cases other lawyers found too complicated, which was the kind of lawyer Wren needed, and which Ruth, who had lived in the Hollow for 79 years, knew exactly where to find. The legal process was not simple. Nothing in Appalachian land title is simple, because the history of property in the region is the history of people who needed to obscure things, and people who were obscured from things. And untangling the two takes patience and specificity. Douglas Fenn had both. The resolution, which came 8 months after Wren lifted the hearthstone, confirmed Wren's title to the cottage and its 4 acres, and corrected the county record on Della's property in Clover Fork simultaneously. The 2 cases had turned out. Through a chain of connection Douglas found when he pulled the full record, to involve the same clerical office making the same category of error 20 years apart. When Douglas explained this to Wren in his office, she sat very still for a moment and then said, quietly and without drama, that she supposed some things had a way of finding each other. Lyle heard about it through a cousin, who had heard it through someone at the county clerk's office. He called Wren once, in the fall. She let it go to voicemail. He said her name. He said he'd heard things had worked out. He said he was glad for her. She deleted the message without saving it and felt nothing in particular, which was not the same as cruelty. It was the absence of investment, which is different, and which she had earned the right to. She put a new roof on the cottage. She already had the roof, courtesy of Silas Crane. What she put on was everything else. A proper floor over the stone in the main room. A salvaged wood stove she found at an estate auction for $30 and paid for from the coin proceeds. A kitchen corner with a countertop she built herself from lumber Silas had left over and showed her how to joint and plane. She fixed the window frames. She built a proper door from reclaimed oak, because the existing door had finally given up. She put a kitchen garden in on the south side of the cottage in the spring, reading the drainage the way Della had taught her, placing each bed where the light and the water said it should go. Ruth came to see it on a Saturday in April, the cottage's first real spring. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the stove throwing heat, the floor sound, the window glass new and clean, and she looked at the hearth, the center slab back in its place, unmarked. "You put it back?" Ruth said. "The stone?" "Yes, with everything still under it." Wren looked at her. "I put the letter and the photograph back," she said. "The deed is with Douglas. The coins went to you, their Gaynor family." She had given Ruth the tin the afternoon they'd sat at the kitchen table. Ruth had tried to decline. Wren had not accepted the decline. "You could have kept them," Ruth said. "I know," Wren said. "I put a note under the hearthstone instead." Ruth looked at the hearth. "What does it say?" Wren thought about how to answer this. "It says who found it, what was here, what happened because of it." She paused. "And that this is a good place, and whoever comes next should treat it accordingly." Ruth stood there for a moment. Then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite something else. "Bessie would have liked you," she said. They had lunch at the kitchen table, soup Ruth had brought in a jar, bread Wren had made that morning, the first time she'd made bread in the cottage, Della's recipe from memory because she had never written it down, and neither had Della because neither of them had needed to. It was a quiet meal. Outside the window, the garden was just starting, and the ridge above the hollow was the pale green of early April, tentative, and then not. Word of the cottage settlement reached Clover Fork through the specific channels that news uses in small communities. A phone call, a comment at the feed store, a thing someone mentioned at church. Whether it reached Lyle specifically, and what he made of it if it did, Wren had stopped being curious about. She had 4 acres and a stone cottage with walls 2 feet thick, and a hearthstone that had held something for 90 years and had let it go to the right person. And she had a neighbor half a mile up the hollow who brought apple butter and had her grandmother's way of seeing, and who had once, on a cold morning in early March, stood in a doorway looking at a young woman standing in the middle of an empty stone room and made an assessment that had turned out to be correct. There is a kind of person who arrives at something that looks like nothing and can read what it actually is. Not luck, skill, the kind built from paying attention to the things that most people look past. Wren Halley had been 21 years old with $11 on a church pew in Alderton, and she had looked at a notice at the bottom of a county filing stack in a heated library and had understood what she was reading before anyone told her what it meant. That is not the same as being fortunate. That is the specific result of having been taught by a woman who pushed biscuits across a table without comment and read land like a language, that the world does not always announce its gifts. Sometimes it tucks them under a hearthstone and waits for the right hands. She was still 21 when the roof went on. She was 22 when Douglas Fenn resolved the title. She was 22 and a half when she made bread in the cottage for the first time and split it with a 79-year-old woman who was the great-great-granddaughter of the woman whose careful hands were resting in a photograph under the hearthstone, beside a note that said, "This is a good place. Whoever you are, welcome to it. Treat it accordingly." If this story reached you today and something in it landed, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be glad if you would. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Has there ever been a moment when something that looked like nothing turned out to be exactly what you needed? Tell us. That's the whole point of this place. Thank you for spending time with Wren today. See you in the next one. She kept a notebook that first year, not a diary in any sentimental sense, more a working record of the land and the cottage and what each season showed her. She had learned this from Della, who had kept the same kind of notebook for 40 years, spiral-bound. A line per day, written in the evening before she slept. Wren's notebook was a composition book she'd bought at the dollar store in Alderton for 60 cents, and she filled it methodically. The first frost date. The drainage pattern on the south slope after a heavy rain, which stones in the garden wall needed reseeding. What the soil composition told her about what would and wouldn't grow. She also wrote on the first page the things she wanted to remember. Della's biscuit recipe, which she had never needed to write down before, and now needed in a different way. The names of the two witnesses on Thomas Gaynor's 1887 deed, which she had memorized without intending to. Bessie Gaynor's exact words from the letter. "This hollow has been good to us, and I believe it will be good to whoever comes next, if they come with honest intentions." She read that line back to herself on more than one evening. Silas Crane came by the cottage periodically through that first year, ostensibly to check on the roof, but actually, Wren understood, because he had found in her assessment of his ridgeland something he hadn't had before, which was a coherent sense of what he was working with, and he had questions that kept occurring to him. They worked out a standing arrangement. He had labor and materials, and she had the reading of land, and the two of them between them could do more than either could alone. He helped her dig the root cellar in October, a project that took 3 weekends and that Wren had designed based on the lay of the ground and the drainage lines she'd mapped, positioned on the north slope of the cottage's foundation where the temperature stayed consistent year-round. He helped her build the door on the root cellar from the same reclaimed oak as the cottage door. They worked without a great deal of conversation, which suited them both, and split whatever came out of the collaboration in a way that neither of them had written down and that both of them kept without difficulty. The root cellar, once it was built, was full by November. Canned tomatoes and beans from the garden, winter squash on the shelf Silas had built from leftover pine, potatoes from a section of the garden that had produced more than Wren had expected. She stood in the doorway of the root cellar on the first cold night in November and looked at what she'd put by and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a long time. It was not pride, exactly, and it was not relief, though it was adjacent to both. It was the feeling of being equal to the thing that was coming, of having done the specific work that the specific moment required, and having done it in time. Ruth Gaynor came by on a Thursday in December with a jar of sorghum and stayed for an hour and told Wren more about Bessie, about the flour sack dresses she'd sewn, and the school in the hollow she'd organized when the county school was too far for the children to walk, and the bread she'd left on porches during the worst years of the Depression. Walking the hollow before dawn so people would find it without knowing who'd left it. The pattern was familiar to Wren in the way that certain patterns become familiar once you know to look for them. People who did things without needing to be seen doing them, who built things meant to last longer than they did, who trusted that the right person would come. She said as much to Ruth. Ruth considered it. Bessie used to say that a kindness done in secret is the only kind that's really free, she said. No one can take credit from you for something they didn't know you did. Wren wrote it in the notebook that evening. She thought about Della, who had pushed biscuits across a table without comment for 20 years. She thought about the hearthstone, and what Bessie had trusted it to hold, and how long it had held it. She was 22 years old. She had a stone cottage and 4 acres, and a root cellar full enough to see her through winter, and a neighbor half a mile up who came by with sorghum and stories about a woman whose hands rested in a photograph beneath the hearthstone. She had a notebook filling up with the language of the land she was learning to tend. She had, beneath it all, the knowledge that she had been the right person, not because anything had been given to her, but because she had shown up at the right time, with honest intentions and the specific skills that the specific place needed, and had done the work, and had not looked for someone to thank her for it. The hearthstone was warm on winter evenings, the wood stove ticking with heat behind it. The cottage walls were 2 feet thick and completely solid. They had been standing since 1887 and would be standing long after everyone in this story was gone, which was exactly what the people who built them had intended. Some things are built to last. Some people build them. Some people find them at the right moment and understand what they are and step inside.